So when you first came to Washington, you were a retired command sergeant major in the Army National Guard, so you were drawn immediately to veterans issues?
I did. I was also a school teacher. I asked to be on that committee, and of course they said no to that one. But I was pleased that I was put on the Veterans Affairs Committee, and I've been there now a little over 10 years since I've been in Congress.
And some of the legislation you've worked on has actually dealt specifically with Guard and Reserve members transitioning to veteran status.
Yeah, it's always been a big issue. Guard and Reserve, obviously you go from civilian job. I was a teacher teaching in my classroom in 2003, got the call up to deploy, and you're deployed, and then you're back in 2004. For me, being a mid-career person, you know, having a teaching job, not quite as hard. For a lot of folks, that's a pretty difficult transition. Same thing happens to our active duty force. When they leave the military, a lot of them came in right off the streets out of high school, had everything done for them, from meals to pay and everything else. Now they're back on the streets. And so one of my things since I've been here to talk about is how do we truly get seamless transition? Why do we have two different medical records? Why do they not communicate with one another as well as they could? Because I think, one, it just makes sense. Also easier for the veterans. And so integrating the National Guard into that full-time force has been a real cause for me.
Now, with regard to transitioning the medical records, this is something the VA and the Department of Defense have been talking about for 15, 20 years perhaps, and there have been different platforms suggested so that a person's military medical record could just electronically move, but it's not there yet, right?
No, and it drives people crazy when I talk to the average person. In all fairness, there's not still a lot of collaboration in the private sector amongst medical records. If you move, you go down to Phoenix, you know, you should be able to pull that up if you're down there on vacation. The real thing is, why do we have different medical records between the DOD and the VA? If we're purchasing power, we could even have more purchasing power if we bought them together. I am more optimistic than I've been in those 20 years. I've talked about this since I've been in Congress for 10 years. Just this week, Secretary Shulkin has said on July 1st he will announce what they're going to do. My hope is they will use the same system that the Department of Defense just purchased this last year. So there's some hope here, and it just makes sense. And I understand that an electronic medical record is not as simple as we think. It's not just a spreadsheet, it's a diagnostic tool. And of course, soldiers in combat have different needs than retired Vietnam veterans, if you will. But it makes no sense both economically, and it makes no sense in ease of transition of why. Because a lot of times a veteran has to prove that they got injured in the military. Sure be easy if you had the record of where they were at when they got injured, just to transfer right over.
Right. Now, that's just one aspect of transition. You talked about other issues that you saw with the Guard unit that you came back from deployment with. What are some of the others that have concerned you, and what might be done from a legislative level to help?
Well, I think we did some of it. There's more to do. I think enhancing the GI Bill with an understanding that Guard and Reserve soldiers now, on average, are going to deploy 4 times. When I first got in 1981, we were kind of there as a strategic reserve. You know, if the Russians, whoever came across Eastern Europe, they were going to throw us in as a last resort type of thing. That has all changed now. And for my example with me, I was artillery. 97% of the artillery is in the National Guard or Reserve now, with an understanding that we are fully integrated into that force, but that causes a lot of issues then. One is that we weren't at parity in terms of GI Bill benefits. We weren't at parity in terms of how do we use and access the VA system, if you will. So there were all those things. Plus there was the issue that's happening in the regular force, but it hits the National Guard hard. What about family when you're deployed that aren't on a military base where many of these things are taken care of? Those families are scattered throughout the country, especially in rural areas where there's not necessarily a support system that understands what it means to be a deployed military family.
So you were able legislatively to make some of those things more comparable, right?
Yeah, enhance the GI Bill. We're still working on that. I think the post 9/11 GI Bill was an incredible step forward. We're starting to get some of that. We're looking at different ways to access the VA, both across the regular force and the National Guard force, with an understanding that a lot of these injuries are mental. They're issues that are impacting them, from post-traumatic stress to mild traumatic brain injuries, and a lot of times when a guardsman leaves, they go back to their civilian focus. There's not that expertise that's in the military or the VA medical system. They're back with their local provider. We made it easier so that they could reach out and access some of those services.
Great. On the education issue, you've expressed some concern about how people with these enhanced benefits have used them, maybe not to their best advantage. What are the issues there?
Yeah, I think it all goes to this transition, and I really think about how we do this, how the military transitions out both to getting jobs, to getting in the system. And one of the things we saw was we have folks who came back, especially younger ones, they transitioned out of the military. They had a very generous and I would say appropriate GI Bill benefit, but there were certainly those out there that preyed on them. They got them into institutions that had no they weren't going to produce a degree or any appreciable skill to get a job. They burned through those benefits, and there they were setting that. So we tightened up the rules on some of the for-profits, the way that was done, trying to do a little better on the counseling side before they leave the military to start thinking about that. And then in some cases, we've enhanced the ability to, why should you have to go back to school to get a CDL license or even helicopter mechanics if we can show that the skill you learned in the military is comparable to the licensing need in the private sector? We were able to smooth some of these people over, and this is really important both for stability. We found that the sooner these folks get a good job or a career, the use of medical, especially mental health medical services, start to drop way down, because it's kind of idle hands are the devil hand in some cases, or some of these things become more complicated. So we were able to do some of that. And now, for example, businesses who partnered with us on this, at the Mayo Clinic, which is in my district, if you go in and put in your military occupational specialty, your MOS, it will spit out all of the jobs that you are qualified to do that they have cross-referenced into that, because a lot of troops say, well, I didn't really do anything. I was just an infantry officer, if you will. Really, you were responsible for the lives of 60 people in your platoon, millions of dollars of equipment. You did complex mission-oriented planning. You are qualified to do this, 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 and this. So I think those are all things that made that transition better. We saw very high unemployment rates at the start of the conflict. Now we're starting to see those come back down. And again, that's about that issue. These veterans are not victims. They didn't win the lottery. What they did was put their lives on hold, serve the rest of us while their peers were starting their careers, buying their houses, getting their education. And these programs are meant to make sure that we can make them whole and get them caught back up again. And I think we're finally getting to the point where we're starting to see some of that.
Now, interestingly, a lot of people who have left military service say, you know, I was really taken care of in the military. A lot of things were done for me, or I was told what to do, and it was very helpful, and now I'm out on my own and I feel a bit lost. So for instance, the idea of how do I shop for the best education, use for my education funds, whose responsibility is that? Obviously, the individual has to take some accountability. Are there ways to better help? And where should that counseling come from? On the military side, on the VA side, or?
This is a great question, and it's the one, if you ask DOD, they'll say the VA. If you ask the VA, they'll say DOD. I oftentimes say how interesting it is that we rarely have them both in the same room. If it were up to me, I would have the veterans budget in with the DOD with an understanding that if you go to war, that comes with cost. I think there's a moral argument to be made there, but I also think there's a much more efficient argument to be made that then we wouldn't be arguing about those things and we would just do it. Because once again, if you say, well, we shouldn't spend any money, the DOD's job is to prepare them to fight for war, and then when they go out the door, they go out the door. Well, if you don't have them prepared to take a job, you're going to play unemployment insurance, or worse yet, you're going to get them in a spiral of addiction or whatever else might fill, because we know those things are there after intense experiences, especially this generation. We're at war for 15 years. So I think that we're working better. I think the service chiefs get this. I've seen a commitment going back to Admiral Mullen at the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He said, you know what, I'm responsible for creating more veterans than anybody since World War II. I feel responsible for them. So they're starting to trade more information. They're starting to get there. And I think this transition assistance program, TAPS, and then they call it Soldier for Life. That's their new thing. And I went and observed this down in Arizona here just a few months ago. They have these folks starting a year out, start thinking about, you're coming to an end. Either you're going to, ETS, that your time of your contract, or you hit your 20 years like you and I. They start thinking about that ahead of time and start planning and start giving them options. And in many cases, we've got folks already enrolled in schools. We've got them credit for their time in the military, or we have them their licensures necessary to be either electricians, pilots, whatever it may be. And then they truly seamlessly walk out the door from the military and they're into their new career. And that takes planning. And your question is very well put. I always frame it in this: it's all of our responsibilities. Our job is to make sure that DOD and VA are communicating, and I kind of think Congress is the driving force behind that. And then we use like these veteran service organizations, the VFW, some of IAVA, the newer generations, to help make that happen. And it is, I think, they're out there. there's 40,000 nonprofits to serve veterans. There is a desire in this country to get it right for veterans, but when you have 40,000 individual nonprofits, it's like having none if you're a soldier. Like you said, I don't know where to go. I don't know how to do this. And I think having that transition assistance program and working and having the VA in there, having the Department of Labor in there, having, you know, private sector entities, Chamber of Commerce has been an incredible partner in this. Having them there on the front end really makes that better.
Our principal goal is to try to find, our sense is that there are a lot of opportunities out there, ways that veterans can find help, groups that want to help veterans, but are hard to find.
Yes.
Or you know, or there's a government program that's a little opaque behind the website. And we're hoping to sort of vet these, find them, vet them, and then make them more easily available.
It is a noble cause, and I think about this, you know, and I retired in 2005 after 24 years, and I didn't even really know myself what the VA did. And I was a senior enlisted soldier. I had taken advantage of the housing, the ability to get a VA home loan, which is helpful, but there were other things in there that I was not even aware as a senior enlisted soldier. So how did my younger soldiers, because I wasn't getting them the information, there was no contact between the VA or any of those folks and us in a National Guard unit. And I think something like this, this program CVS is doing is fabulous, because I don't want to say one-stop shopping, but you've got to have somebody that is kind of a repository, a place where you can go. And I have said this, and they've gotten better, but when I first got out and tried to use the website at the VA, I gave up. It was too much information. It needs to be tailored, and I think with this newer generation, they're good at going out and finding information. I think there's a skill, though, of sifting through information that is still takes time, and it's helpful if you've got somebody like what you're trying to do, bring that together.
Making it easier to navigate
easier
is our hope. As you've, in an oversight capacity, you've looked at VA, what have you found are there areas of excellence? What does the VA do very well?
Well, and I also, as I said, I represent the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, and so I get to see healthcare systems. The VA delivers quality care, especially things like cardiac care and, of course, traumatic injury care, polytrauma type things. They do that as well as anybody. They research better than almost anybody, you know, whether it be heart stents, pacemakers, to hepatitis C. That all came out of the VA. The VA underpins our entire healthcare system. 80% of our doctors train going through a VA system, so they're very good at that. They administer our cemeteries as well as I think could ever be done. I think if there were a Fortune 500 and you rank them, the VA's portion, because I don't think a lot of people see VA as having these other, you know, they have three main missions. They have that healthcare mission, they have the cemetery missions, and then they have the Veterans Benefit Administration to hand out benefits for injuries. I think they do very well on the first two. I think they do an adequate job, not great. We maybe can help them a little bit on their appeals. So when it comes to delivery of care, delivery of the care of final rites and how we intern in our VA cemeteries, they for the most part do a very good job. They don't do a good job of communicating in terms of how people get in. They don't do a very good job of the maybe the full customer service piece. When the VFW asks people, this is what's kind of a disconnect with the public, 92% of veterans really have a high mark of how they receive care in the VA, and they like it. If you ask an average citizen, they think that these are rat-infested hellholes that no one wants to go to. That's not the case. The problem is when they hear a story about Phoenix or access to it, it makes them angry about it. So I think the VA, when it comes to quality care, research, those types of things, fabulous. Things they do terribly, building hospitals, managing those types of things. They should not be in that business. And I think what the VA should, and Secretary Shulkin has said this, they should focus on their core competencies, and we should use others to do some of these other things. So they're very they want to hold on to their areas when I think we should loosen some of those up. But I've said it since I've been in Congress. I am their harshest critic, but I'm their staunchest supporter when they need it. And I think that balance, and I wish the public would be that way, when the VA does something well, because keep in mind, 50% of the VA employees are veterans themselves. When the VA, and they see 80 million visits a year, the vast majority come out as good as private sector or better than the private sector. You need to tell that story. But when a veteran waits and waits and waits and isn't called back or doesn't have their appeal heard for 10 years, we should be angry.
Where do you think that disconnect comes from in that front end? And because lots of other people have mentioned this, and so you think, well, okay, it's an area that they can focus on, but what seem to be the intractable issues that make that a real speed bump for them?
Yeah, I think like anything, both private sector and I think the oversimplification that government can't, government only can do certain things, but there's certain things the private sector should do pretty well. I think there's, inside the VA, they want to be all things to all people. I do think there's some of that. And then I think like the private sector, it's undeniable. Bureaucracies can feed upon themselves. They can be self-sustaining in and of themselves. And people can lose track of what the real mission is. I think that's a danger in large organizations in the private sector. I think it's a danger into the VA. And so it's not for lack of a cruelness or not caring. Everyone I meet wants to do this right. But it ends up being the process becomes more important than the end result. If you're focused on a good result for that veteran and everything is focused on that, I think most things will work out. But when it becomes, well, I have to see these people in 10 days. If I don't see them in 10 days, I'm going to get a bad review from my supervisor. So I'm just going to figure out a way to make it look like I saw them in 10 days. Now all of a sudden you're into that ethical area of fudging records, trying to perpetuate your own job. So I think it's probably a lot of human nature. I think it's, to be very honest with you, we were unprepared for the usage of the VA that came with a time of war and an aging Vietnam veteran population that was starting to hit its peak. The peak, and this is what people don't understand, the VA being hit with a backlog of claims and not being able to get appointments isn't because of this current war. It's a little bit like I say, the rabbit through the anaconda. The average time when the usage of after a conflict is 40 to 50 years. So the peak usage for the VA of World War II veterans was the 1990s. This is now the peak usage of the end of the Korean War and the Vietnam veterans. What we need to understand is the peak of this conflict is not going to come till 2040 or after. So one of the things with this seamless transition and things I've been asking for is, why are we not planning for the VA of 2050? That's what we should be doing, not the VA of 2017 or 2018. And we go from fire to fire instead of this. And again, 10 years ago when I first came to Congress, this struck me as, I couldn't believe it. The Department of Defense does quadrennial defense reviews because the threats change. Who would have thought the threat was going to come from people flying planes into that? Well, in 1992, the Defense Department actually wrote a quadrennial defense review that brought that up. And so they were thinking what the threats were. In the VA, there is no long-range planning document that says how many veterans are we going to see in 2040? How many hospitals do we need? How many doctors do we need? And it just this is where the argument that government just self-perpetuates, self-feeds on itself is true. But I would make the argument that the VA has to be there. It's great that nonprofits want to help. I don't know if that nonprofit's going to be around in 2050. The VA must be around in 2050. And I think that's where a lot of this comes in. But it's not out of malice. It's not out of heartless. It's not they don't care about veterans. And it's not just because it's government. It's a lot of those things that plague large organizations. And I would say plague large organizations without long-term plans. And in fairness to the VA, this is the world's largest healthcare organization, basically. Who would plan on 3 months at a time in budgets like what we do with them on continuing resolutions? And I'm very proud, you talked about the legislation we passed, something I worked on and authored when I first got here because we were in the government shutdown phase. We authored advanced appropriations on VA healthcare. So if the government shuts down because of our political bickering, the one agency that will continue to go on is the healthcare for our veterans will not be impacted by that. And that seems to make sense. And I'm not talking government on autopilot. What I'm talking about is give them some certainty to plan.
To allow them to do the long-range planning.
Yeah, do the long-range planning. That's lacking. I really believe that. Not for lack that they don't want to. It's just never been implemented. And I've argued that Congress should force a quadrennial VA review. And let's look at what does the VA look in 2050? What's it look in 2030? What's it look in 2020? And then we can plan accordingly.
Anything I've not asked you now you've given us some interesting ideas of things that we're going to follow in our reporting, but anything that we've not discussed that needs to be on that agenda?
No, I don't think so. And as I said earlier, that yesterday on the floor, we got the opportunity to do this, that this is still one of the last bastions that there is true camaraderie and a true sense of purpose. I think it could extend to all areas of government, but I think it's our responsibility. These veterans serve regardless of political affiliation. It's our responsibility to get it right for them. I think if there's a tendency to bend over backwards to take the politics as much as we can, the partisanship, if you will, there's always politics, but to take the partisanship out of these issues on VA, it is still happening. And I think in a time when most people don't believe that, their faith in Congress is, you know, ridiculously low, the VA committee is still doing that. So I, as the ranking member, and I know my chairman, Phil Rowe, who I have the greatest respect for, is we understand part of our job is to do that. So I think if you could, you know, reestablishing, you know, people's trust in this. My biggest fear is that people just give up the what good's the VA committee, what good's the VA. That's a bad place for us to end up. So hopefully that's turning.
Great.
Thanks.
I appreciate the conversation.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
Great questions.